happy to continue to bring our members high-quality speakers speaking on timely and significant topics. We are proud to have Bill Dedman with us today. Bill Dedman is a Pulitzer Prize and Peabody Award-winning investigative reporter, best-selling author, and keynote speaker. He has spoken on fair housing and fair lending issues to the National Association of Realtors, the Federal Reserve, HUD, and Bacon and Real Estate Associations. Bill received the 1989 Pulitzer Prize in investigative reporting for his work at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on The Color of Money. His series on racial discrimination by banks and savings and loans associations in middle-income Black neighborhoods. 30 years later, Bill was one of 4 lead reporters on Newsday's undercover investigation of racial steering by real estate agents, Long Island Divided. The investigation, published in November of 2019, revealed that Long Island's dominant residential real estate brokerages help reinforce racial segregation through illegal steering of customers. Newsday's team received several national awards for their work, including a Peabody Award. Long Island Divided and its 40-minute documentary film, Testing the Divide, are online at newsday.com/divided. Bill has reported for the Associated Press, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, and the Boston Globe. Please join us in welcoming Bill Dedman.
Thank you, Andy, and good morning to everybody. I'm excited to have this opportunity to share with you our Newsday team's work on fair housing, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's gratifying. It's also a little surprising that so many real estate associations around the country have responded to our Newsday team's investigation, and more importantly, are using it to provoke a conversation. I'm hoping that together we can dive into looking at some of the Newsday video clips of agents in action, perhaps not on their best days. And I'm hoping that we can discuss a few of the implications of this investigation. We can talk about schools and what agents can say. We can talk about new training and new state laws coming in New York. Also, I'm hoping that we can examine some of the fixes that you might think would help solve unequal treatment in real estate. And we can talk about how far those fixes might go. As real estate professionals, you'll have your own reactions and your own thoughts. I'm hoping that this session will be helpful to you, but also challenging, something for you to take action on.
So Bill, you won the Pulitzer Prize for an investigation into mortgage lending practices. I thought it might be interesting for our viewers to hear a brief summary of that investigation, as well to show how long you've been doing this and the brief of it.
So the stories in the Atlanta newspapers were called The Color of Money. They were about redlining, the old practice of mortgage lenders doing business on one part of the map, but not another. This was back in the late 1980s, and redlining had gotten a lot of attention earlier, but seemed to be thought of as something from the past. But we found lenders were making home loans in white areas, even lower income white areas, but not in any Black areas, even the highest income ones, which, in Atlanta, there's the home of Coretta Scott King and Andrew Young and executives from Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola. And they weren't able to get loans in those neighborhoods from the Atlanta banks. So we looked at how the banks and the savings and loans were operating. We found differences in branch locations, in which real estate agents the marketing from the lenders went out to, even where customers could put in a loan application. And I think one lesson for me was how small actions, perhaps unintentional actions, taken even by lower or mid-level employees at the bank could have a huge impact that would last for a long time. I'd also like to mention a later project at the Boston Globe about something different, traffic stops, who gets a ticket and who gets a warning when you're pulled over for speeding. The series was called Speed Trap, and you can find it online at the Globe. An interesting thing about being stopped by an officer for speeding is that you were probably speeding. And also, you have no way to know if you're being treated equally. If you get a break, a warning, does everyone get one? If you get a ticket, was the officer treating you the same as everyone else? What we found was that in Massachusetts, who got a ticket was easy to predict if you knew the race, sex, and age of the driver. For example, women got a break, especially younger women, up to about age 40. It's just the same as who gets roles in Hollywood. Minorities rarely got a break, especially Black and Latino men. So there seemed to be some racial profiling at work at the window when the officer was making that decision. For me, the interesting part was that just as with home mortgages, the public records were able to answer questions about what was happening. You know, we were coming along afterwards looking at the records, and then we had to dig in to find out, well, how does it happen? What's different about Long Island Divided and this project about real estate is that we weren't coming along later. With the video cameras, we could watch people violating the law. I also think it mattered that we name names. The other stories were about broad issues. You might call them systemic issues, not one person at fault. But those stories sort of focused on the banks or the police. But here you could see specific agents and their faces and names and the logos from their real estate companies. And I think that made a difference in the impact that the stories had.
The Newsday investigation has become the most prominent example of the existence of race-based bias in real estate. Why did Newsday start the investigation in the beginning?
Interesting. So many of you are familiar with Long Island. So we're talking about an area of 3 million people in 2 counties stretching east of New York City. And it's a heavily segregated suburb, perhaps the most heavily segregated in the country. What we mean by that is that there's a lot of diversity overall, people of all races and nationalities. But African Americans especially, of whatever wealth or income, are concentrated in very few communities. Out of more than 200 communities on Long Island, most of the African American residents live in only 8 of those communities. And we had long heard anecdotes from Black homebuyers, even our own colleagues at Newsday, encountering problems when they tried to buy a home in a white or partly integrated area. And we were familiar with testing, sending out pairs of renters or home buyers, as is done by states and fair housing groups. And we also noticed that an anniversary was coming up. It was, we were approaching the 50th anniversary of the Federal Fair Housing Act. So we wanted to take the temperature to see how things were. So we followed those testing methods used by fair housing agents, adding hidden cameras for video and audio. All of our testers wore cameras, and that's legal in New York. It's legal in most states. Most state laws require only one party to a conversation, and that can be the home buyer, to consent to having a conversation audio recorded. There are about a dozen states where hidden audio recording is not allowed, but you can still have testing everywhere. Testers can take notes and be debriefed, and you can look at the listings that they're given. Why don't we look at a first little bit of documentary film? Our project's called Long Island Divided. We called the film Testing the Divide. They're both at the same address, newsday.com/divided. The problem that's highlighted in this video clip is what we were surprised to find was a barrier to entry, a failure to serve one customer at all when another customer in the same circumstance does get service. Let's look at this.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood.
Mixed neighborhood.
If agents are courteous and professional, how can you know that they're treating you equally compared with someone of a different race or ethnicity?
I have to say it without saying it, you know.
Behind smiles and handshakes, how do you know if they're giving you fewer options or suggesting different areas?
I'm not going to send you anything you want to get unless you don't want to store your car to buy your friend.
Or that rules don't apply to you and another home buyer in the same way.
Yeah, okay, I definitely need that.
Long Island is one of America's most segregated suburbs. Newsday set out to discover what role real estate agents might play in keeping it that way, potentially affecting the quality of lives.
Technically, as a real estate agent, we shouldn't tell the buyers.
In house hunting, it's nearly impossible to see evidence of hidden discrimination. You would never know unless you go undercover.
In one test, Johnny Mae Alston was the black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester. And they met with Anne-Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor. They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
You pre-qualified, I guess. My husband's working with somebody in a bank. We've done some preliminary talks, about getting pre-approved.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out any money unless I do have a pre-qualification letter. So I need to. So that means I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can you start looking at houses? I would say not this coming week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny Mae couldn't get any listings. And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. They had the same finances, the same budget, and they made the same request in the same area. But one was white, the other was black. The agent treated them differently.
Bill, can you give us a summary of the tests? Who was tested and what was the outcome?
Yes, Andy, I think it's important for people to understand sort of the process and what choices we made. Our Newsday team focused on home sales, sending out first-time home buyers one at a time to see the same agent. We'd send a white home buyer shopping for his or her family, and then separately an Asian home buyer, or a black home buyer or a Hispanic home buyer. And we would mix up who approached the agent first. The testers would give the agent the same circumstances and constraints on their home search. So they followed the same script. First-time home buyers, so selling another property was not involved. We chose home buyers of the same gender. They were roughly the same age. They were dressed in the same business casual style. I even went to Nordstrom and bought the purses. Same geographic area that they would ask about. They were looking for the same number of bedrooms and had the same family size. And they were asking for the same price range, up to so many dollars. They were also prepared to give the same credit scores or income if asked, but they were rarely asked any financial information other than the mortgage pre-approval status, in which, again, they were both the same. We shot for prices from entry level to the high end. Now, in New York City area prices, entry level was about $400,000, up to the high end, $7 million. Now, that won't get you the Baldwin's house on the Hamptons, but it'll get you in their neighborhood. And we saw the same agent. Now, that wouldn't really be necessary for a fair housing lawsuit. Under federal and state laws, 2 different agents at the same brokerage are also supposed to treat customers equally. But we thought it would be more fair and more persuasive to have the same agent see both customers. By the way, we didn't pick the agents, the brokerages picked the agents. Whoever was taking calls or walk-ins or internet contacts, whoever was on the board for that brokerage that hour, that's who the agent was. We did 86 of these matched pairs or tests at 12 companies or brands. And we picked those 12 because together they represent more than half of the sellers in our market. Coldwell Banker, Keller Williams, Century 21, Remax, as well as the large regional brands. We tested each company many times. Our testers, some came from church groups, but mostly we used out-of-work actors because they're so plentiful in New York. And we recruited them and trained them. They were trained with their identities and how to answer questions in a neutral way. We wanted to make sure that we weren't putting the differences in the test. And that's another reason that we had the video cameras. The testers would meet with the agents, receive listings, and go on home tours. Our team then reviewed more than 200 hours of videos to see how the customers were treated and analyzed the thousands of listings to see what school districts and communities they had been given. We didn't feel comfortable making a judgment ourselves, so we had two fair housing experts review each test for evidence of unequal treatment. One had run a testing program for the Department of Justice and leads a fair housing group, and the other is a law professor who wrote the textbook on fair housing law. And only if both of our referees independently threw a flag did we count the agent with a penalty. We gave the agents and their brokerages the details and let them come in to watch the videos before we published so they could respond to our findings. And we put the videos online so everyone could see them. So there wouldn't be any out of context. You can watch it all. You can see the maps of listings given to each buyer. You can read what our experts had to say about each case. So I want you to understand that this was a careful effort. It took more than 3 years. This was not a drive-by investigation. Now the results. The agents gave unequal treatment in 40% of our tests, 4 out of 10 times. But the results were not the same for different types of pair. I'll explain. 19% of the time, 2 out of 10, Asian buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts, 2 out of 10 times. 39% of the time, 4 out of 10, Hispanic buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts. And 49% of the time, half the time, Black buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts. Now, most of the attention has been on that high difference for Black customers because of historic discrimination, because of discussion of discrimination against African Americans in the culture. But I'd say don't lose sight of the rest. If 4 out of 10 Hispanic buyers or 2 out of 10 Asian buyers are being treated poorly, half a century after the civil rights laws were passed, then those seemed like high numbers as well. We viewed this as a test of the gatekeepers in real estate to see how they were performing. We don't pretend that you would get at the exact same result in a scientific sense if you did tests everywhere in the nation. We don't know. But it is fair to say that most of these major national and regional real estate companies were contributing to the racial segregation in our suburbs. 2 out of the 12 companies passed all of their tests, and we wrote about that as well. These were 2 of the local companies. I guess the question you have to ask yourself is would the results be the same or different if we repeated the tests in Syracuse or Skaneateles or in any community in America? Most of the disparities, let me describe what different kinds of things we saw, were what we would call steering, and we'll talk more about steering. But Black buyers, for example, got fewer listings the wider the area. So if you asked to be within 20 minutes of a community, and that 20-minute circle included areas of different races, The wider the area, the less likely the black buyer was to get any listings in that white neighborhood or community or school district. Overall, for minority buyers, agents directed 1 out of 4 of our minority buyers into different communities and school districts altogether than their white counterparts. We also were surprised. There were also agents who just refused to serve customers, usually because of pre-approval, as you saw in that example. Both buyers had no pre-approval, but that was a barrier for only one. Some agents also wouldn't help our Black or Hispanic buyer unless they signed an exclusive contract with that brokerage, but the same agent didn't require a contract of our white buyer. There also were inappropriate comments made by agents, and we were very surprised by this. Almost always, these comments were said to our white home buyers only. Minority buyers rarely heard anything inappropriate. Here's a video clip that highlights the problem of inappropriate comments.
Hispanic community came in, and they really took over Springs in Northwest Woods area.
Here, an agent gives conflicting advice about Freeport.
I like Freeport. Now you have a bad school district, and that's not good for resale value.
On the school bus, see the moms that are hanging out on the corners.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood. It's been the United Nations.
Because you might be more comfortable in a certain demographic area that isn't heavily one way or another in terms of the people.
Bayshore has 2 school districts, Brentwood and Bayshore. You don't want to have Brentwood school districts. You want to have Bayshore school district.
I can't say anything, but I encourage you, I want you to go there at 10 o'clock at night with your white diapers. Go to that 7-Eleven. They didn't buy there.
No, that's great.
I have to say it without saying it. You know, you have the knowledge of the areas.
Yes.
You know. I don't want to use the word steer, but I try to use another word. I educate in the areas. You know.
Yeah.
How are you, Russ?
Hey, Russ.
Good. How are you?
We're either waiting for the owner or waiting for the agent to show up.
You don't want to be, I don't think you should be in Elmont. I think you should probably just be Franklin Square.
And I remember specifically, he talked about steering.
Yes, that's what he said. Steering, yeah.
Yeah. And in the same breath, he mentioned, well, steering's bad, but this is what I'm going to do.
There's something called steering. No steering, you know, like steering.
Oh, like a car or something?
No,
oh.
like a horse, even.
It wasn't infrequent for an agent to say, I shouldn't say this, but it's sort of the real estate equivalent of hold my beer. I have a sense that some agents have gotten the message that complying with the fair housing laws means not saying the wrong thing, as though it's some sort of political correctness, or not saying the wrong thing to the wrong person who might complain about it. One impression is that we might need to give more attention to steering and differential treatment. In other words, on what agents do instead of what they say. And are we giving the same advice and listings to all clients? Are we pre-qualifying all clients in the same way?
So we've been talking about steering. What forms did this unequal treatment take?
Yeah, Andy, steering, as you know, is an imprecise term. It's often used as a catch-all for various behaviors. I'll describe some of those. So showing one person an apartment while telling another person that there are no apartments available, or telling one person, you won't find any housing in that area in your price range, but showing housing in that price range to others. We saw that happen. Asking one customer for ID, but not the other customer, is a form of steering. Making unsolicited comments about the race or ethnicity or religion of people who live in an area, or comments about the schools or crime or resale values. as a way of encouraging or discouraging someone from living there, that's steering, especially if you're giving contrary information to someone else or being silent on those matters. You saw an example there. We heard agents tell white buyers to avoid an area because of poor resale values while encouraging minority buyers to look there. Just providing more service to one group than another is a form of steering. Overall, our white testers got more listings than their black counterparts, 50% more listings. It was more equal for white and Asian and white and Hispanic buyers. Now, we've been talking about it in terms of the buyers, but think about it for a moment from a neighborhood perspective. If you look at it neighborhood by neighborhood, across all our tests, we found that there were mostly white communities where nearly all the listings that were sent to our white buyers. So minorities, even though they were asking about an area that included those communities, were in effect shut out or steered around them. But we also had something else we didn't expect. We had minority communities or communities with even a middling minority population where no one got listed. Homes were for sale, but minority and white buyers were steered around those communities. Now, if you think about it, our experts said, well, who would have the legal case in that? Well, it's the communities. The governments of those towns, those communities would have a lawsuit under the fair housing laws against those agents and their brokerages. And so might everyone who's tried to sell a home in the last few years and their listing agents, because by steering around a community for all buyers, you're harming the resale values in those communities. We are not saying that real estate agents created segregation. Many of you have read Richard Rothstein's wonderful book, The Color of Law. I encourage you to read it if you haven't, which lays segregation at the feet of government action back to the 1930s, with racial covenants limiting who could buy a property, and more importantly, with financing available only to white buyers when the modern suburbs were developed. Professor Rothstein is focused on government action, not the actions of appraisers or lenders or real estate agents. We agree that agents haven't created segregation, but there has been a pattern of following the lines that had been laid down and helping to reinforce those boundaries. Here's another video clip that gives what you would think of as just a classic example of steering. One man and his family, teenage child, student, are warned off of living in an area, while another man and his family, same age, are told that it would be a good place to live.
Kelvin Toon is a black man in his early 50s, and he went in to meet with an agent involving a test in the Brentwood community, a community that is 80% Hispanic and black. The agent communicated to Kelvin, our black tester, that she enjoyed meeting with clients from the Brentwood area.
Every time I get a new listing in Brentwood or a new client, I get so excited because they're the nicest people. When we sent Kelvin's counterpart in to meet with the same agent, the white tester was actually warned about Brentwood not being a nice place.
The nursing home we need to be near is in Brentwood.
Okay.
And so we found a couple that are in Brentwood.
Pretty close to each other.
Okay. And it just seemed like those would be handy also for going.
Do you want to give me them and I'll look into them for you? Or?
Yeah, I can do that.
That warning came later to the white testers saying there was concern about gang activity going on in Brentwood. This agent wanted the white tester to know, but that information wasn't provided to Kelvin, the black tester. The listings centered black tester Kelvin in Brentwood with 27 house listings. while the white tester got 0 listings in Brentwood and was directed towards much whiter neighborhoods.
Bill, do you think the agents included in the documentary were knowingly steering? We can assume from the statement of some of them that they were, or do you think some of it is an unconscious bias?
It's an interesting question. The first point is that it doesn't matter legally. The Fair Housing Act, your state and local laws are not mind readers, and neither are journalists. If an agent is treating one person better than another similarly situated person, and the difference between them is one of the 7 categories in the Fair Housing Act, that agent has violated the law. To remind you, those categories are color, race, religion, national origin, disability, sex, and family status, which we usually take to mean having children or being pregnant. You also have state and local laws that include marital status and sexual orientation. It is interesting, though it doesn't matter legally, it is interesting to speculate about the motivations of the agents. If you're going to solve something, it's worth thinking about why it happens. Some of the agents may in effect be profiling. That is, assuming that the person of color in front of them can't really afford homes in that price range, or can't qualify for the mortgage, or will be wasting the agent's time, while accepting the same price range without question from a white buyer. That could be conscious, it might be unconscious bias. One of the tricky things about profiling is that it's so ineffective. You know, we usually talk about profiling as though it's a shortcut to success, but it's controversial because it's some sort of politically incorrect thing. But experts keep trying to point out to us that the real problem with profiling is that it doesn't work. Let's say you want to stop school shootings. Focusing on the students who play video games or who dress a certain way is not a good way to identify a school shooter. There's no profile of type of student who's a school shooter. But there are behaviors, gathering weapons, making threats. At the airport, religion is not a good way to identify who will be a terrorist. Who's staking out security might be a good way. You know, race in real estate is not a good way to identify which customers can afford a home. So it's ineffective counterterrorism, it's ineffective policing, it's ineffective real estate sales. To put it another way, you leave too much money on the table. Any profile would include too many of the wrong people and not enough of the right people. So besides, profiling is illegal. Now, some agents may think that they'll make money faster with less effort if they show people homes where you'll feel comfortable. You heard an agent say something very much like that. But why assume that people want segregated neighborhoods? Again, you're leaving money on the table. Besides, it's illegal. It's possible that some agents may have a strong anti-minority bias. I assume that is a tiny group, which leads to the conclusion that to stop steering, we need to look at other factors. There wouldn't be this much steering if only a tiny group is responsible. I think it's possible that some agents may be acting out of sort of a referred bias. Well, you know, like a referred pain, you have your jaw's hurting, but it's really your shoulder causing it. A referred bias. The agents might be bowing to bias that they expect from others. Maybe they think that potential sellers would be angry if they brought minority buyers to their home or into the neighborhood. Maybe the neighbors who are potential customers as sellers. Or maybe an agent thinks that appraisers or lenders would be biased. And there's evidence for that. You probably saw the study just this past year about differences in appraisal depending on whether there were signs in the home that the home was being sold by an African-American family. There was an anecdote in that study of the family that took down the pictures of the relatives and raised their home $100,000 in value on the next appraisal. So maybe agents are expecting bias by others. Again, none of that matters legally. In general, on issues of race, you may agree that it's easy to apply all the heat to the sort of question, who's being a racist, or are they saying that we're being racist? It's really more productive to apply light to the question, how does it work in our office? Is what we're doing treating people the same or differently? And under the law, it's what you do that counts. I think it's also interesting to think about this from the homebuyer's perspective. It's important to note that our testers had usually been entirely unaware that they were being treated better or worse. They all got a helpful attitude from the agents, and the African-American testers would come back and say to us, she was so nice, she was so helpful. And only when they saw the videos and we told them the map of where their listings were compared with the counterpart, did they see that they were treated differently. Here's a little video where you'll meet some of our testers and you'll hear from a fair housing expert who works with them.
It almost makes me wish that the racism is more explicit so that I would know about it.
Too often I hear people who maybe aren't as familiar with this kind of work say, oh, well, they were just testers. But all you have to do is tell someone, which I have to do on a fairly regular basis, that you were turned down because of your race, and tell them the circumstances that occurred on a particular test. And you will see just how real and painful that injury is.
Elmont, it's okay, it's good, you're very close to the city. Some of them are not as nice, Elmont.
I do remember him, he was nice, and I do remember him pointing out on the map.
Oh, he loved that map. I remember that.
Yeah, he had the map, and he's like,
Some of these towns, in my opinion, are not necessarily the greatest in terms of school districts, safety, crime, resale.
One of the patterns that startled us was that agents time and again would begin their presentations to the buyers, and these were new customers, with inappropriate comments or information that violates the Fair Housing Act. That agent with the map, a second generation real estate agent, he looked like General Patton planning the invasion of Sicily, but he had a different invasion plan for the white buyer than he did for the other. It didn't seem as though these were offhand, casual comments or spontaneous slurs. This actually seemed to be the sales pitch. The standard guidance from that agent was to drive by the minority communities before you even start your search out in other neighborhoods. I hate to say it, but it seemed that for that agent and some others, steering was the service that they were selling.
So what role did schools play in the actions of agents then?
Oh, time and again, we heard agents explain to our buyers, everything is done by schools. The underlying fact is that America's school districts are very segregated by race in many communities, so that directing someone to a certain school district is the same as directing them to an area with a higher or lower minority population, whether race gets mentioned or not. It's hard for us to believe, but America's schools are more segregated now than they were 30 years ago. Schools are the biggest way that segregation happens in America. And it was routine for agents in our tests to use schools as a sorting mechanism, touting one district over another. This district's blue ribbon, that one's declining. And often they would give different information to different buyers. Now, around the country, this gets complicated, but some agents have picked up the idea that, well, you can't talk about schools at all. You've heard agents say, oh, I can't mention schools. Well, the Fair Housing Act doesn't say that. Agents can give straightforward, factual information, or answer questions, or refer customers to websites with information. The problem arises when the agents are picking and choosing different districts for different customers, or making comments about the demographics in schools steering customers, especially when different information is given to different buyers, or one buyer is told that information and we're silent with the other one. Here's a discussion of schools from our video, and you'll see the expert in here who is the law professor from Kentucky who wrote the text on fair housing.
I said, do you really want your future children going to Amityville School District?
We're going to try and stay away from Freeport, Roosevelt, Hempstead for now because of the school district.
This part, the Salisbury part, is in demand because the schools are much, much, much better.
In Newsday's 86-pair tests, agents often applied a laser-like focus on school districts, highlighting their perceived quality when recommending places that house hunters should consider buying or avoid. Fair housing experts say touting or disparaging school districts can put agents in jeopardy because talking about school districts can be taken as a euphemism for race.
There's a few districts that I know I would I won't look in those towns.
Oh, okay.
You know, like Freeport and Baldwin and Amityville, which is part of Massapequa schools, but it's just certain parts of Massapequa.
If the customer asked about the quality of the schools and the agent responded with accurate information, I think the agent would be fine. The problem with talking about differentials in schools is that at least in the last 10 or 15 years, that has been a proxy for race. They don't mention the race of the community. Good schools are available in these areas. Those areas I'd stay away from because they have poor schools. I want to ask, did you tell that to the other tester? If you're only giving that information to one tester of the two, and the only difference is the race, then you've provided what I call differential service.
If you're in Massapequa, you only want school district 23. Okay. You don't want 6 in Massapequa because that takes in Amityville, and you're not going to like those schools.
Now, this advice about what to say and not say about schools has gotten a little more complicated, and let me try to touch on that complexity. It's okay to talk about, to give honest information, accurate information about quality of schools. But what would you use to indicate whether a school was high quality or not? Write this on the blackboard 100 times. School test scores don't tell you how good a school is. I'm sorry, they don't. School test scores tell you mostly how wealthy are the parents who send their kids to that school. Wealth is a very good predictor in America of education. Education of the parents is a very good predictor of the student's test score. Race is a good predictor of wealth. You see the circle. So a high-performing school may just be one with higher wealth and education among the parents. And a school with lower test scores may actually be the higher performing one, bringing up the scores of students who are growing up with fewer advantages. How to make sense of this? Just recently, greatschools.org, the school ranking website that many realtors refer customers to, has realized this pitfall, and it's changing its ratings to try to emphasize other factors like parent surveys and improvements in school test scores, not just the overall score, because it realized that in states where it was basing the ratings entirely on test scores, it was perpetuating segregation. It was perpetuating this idea that white schools equals good schools. NAR has spoken up in favor of this change and is saying that it's going to study this further because it realizes that the current advice is insufficient. It's helpful. You can answer factual questions, but NAR recognizes that you can get in a gray area when you get beyond objective criteria, when you start to use labels such as good or nice or high performing, that those may just reflect who goes to that school, not the quality of the school.
So lots of good information, lots of different reactions. What was the reaction from the real estate industry and the government?
Yeah, so it's Andy, it's fair to say that the Newsday series has raised a variety of reactions. First of all, here in New York, the governor and attorney general announced investigations, and those are continuing. Often I'm asked, what happened to the agents in the videos? And we didn't focus on trying to cause discipline for a particular agent, but we're watching to see what happens. And no agent has faced state discipline yet. The agents and their brokers were called to testify before a state Senate committee hearing. They were sworn in and were asked questions. You can watch that video online. And it's fascinating. Some handled it well. They said they hadn't understood that they were violating the law, but they realized that what they said was inappropriate. Others didn't have such a good day and got a public thrashing from the senators. The agent you saw who said, follow the school bus, see what mothers are waiting to meet the bus. She was asked, why did you tell people that? And she said, oh, I just wanted the buyers to learn where the bus routes were. And the agent who said the Hispanics were taking over this neighborhood in the Hamptons, he said, well, he meant that in a positive way. And one senator told the agent, on behalf of everyone with a brain, I'd like to tell you how ridiculous you sound. The most surprising part of the hearing was that the brokers all said that they had reviewed the tests and the videos and found nothing wrong. They all said, no, our agents did not violate the law. And the position seemed to be that if steering wasn't intentional, if we didn't mention race, it's not illegal. You know better, and the senators know better. And it's clear that New York is going to have greater regulations about steering. If you want to stop speeding, you turn on the radar. Some enforcement will matter. So after the hearing, the state Senate, just this past month, unanimously approved changes to state laws. So it hasn't gone to the state assembly yet, but the state Senate unanimously approved these. Let me just show you a little slide with these changes. Testing, adding to your fees to pay for that testing, procedures for intaking clients all to be the same, training on implicit bias, so better training, more damages available to victims of discrimination, and doubling the fines. Also, more of a duty to supervise. And requiring housing programs to look at furthering fair housing. In other words, ending segregation is a goal. Now, other states are also talking about increasing testing of agents. And nationally, HUD's enforcement division is talking about stepping up in fair enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. That seemed unlikely under the previous administration, but under the new president, that seems much more likely.
Based on your investigations, what do you think are the best ways to combat racism in real estate?
Well, Andy, the main goal may not be to combat racism as it is to combat unequal treatment. Let's talk about what NAR's response has been. The National Association of Realtors has responded vigorously to Newsday's investigation, and these things are worth talking about. And I know you're going to hear from Alexia Smokler from NAR. Before our stories landed, NAR had hired Brian Green, who came from HUD's Fair Housing effort, to be NAR's Director of Fair Housing Policy. So he'd been on the job 2 weeks when our stories hit. Welcome to the job, Brian. And they have a new program called ACT, A for accountability, C for culture change, T for training. So about accountability, first there's this idea of NARs working with state associations to ensure that state licensing laws meet a national standard for fair housing enforcement. That's new, to have the National Association working with state associations to bring up enforcement of fair housing laws. NAR is also developing a voluntary program of self-testing. In other words, a cookbook to help real estate companies test their own agents. The chairman of Realogy, which, as you know, owns Century 21 brand and Coldwell Banker and Sotheby's International and others. The head of that company has said we should be testing our own agents to see whether they're complying with the fair housing laws. That would be a huge change. And NAR is saying, we're going to meet you halfway. We're going to put the pieces together to make it easier for companies to start a testing program. That's accountability. C stands for culture change. NAR says this is probably the hard part. You know that violating the fair housing laws is a violation of the Realtors Code of Ethics. You may not know that same code of ethics, at least during my lifetime, required realtors to enforce racial segregation. It was a violation of the Realtors Code of Ethics to sell a home to a Black person in a white neighborhood. So let's acknowledge that cultures can be changed, and that there's a long tradition in America of redlining, of blockbusting, of predatory subprime lending that strips home equity out of minority neighborhoods. These are not just historical facts, but they're facts that have effects that continue for generations, because home equity is the money you use to pass down to the grandkids and to send the kids to college. So NAR says we want to try to change the culture. Now, a big part of that will be figuring out how to talk about schools, and we've addressed that. Finally, T stands for training. Newsday's team went to the training already required in New York for re-upping your license, and our reporters shared the curriculum with experts who found that the training was weak and jokey and hardly mentioned steering at all. And the New York State Association of Realtors suspended its fair housing training to rewrite the curriculum. NAR is also improving its training materials, partly to focus on unconscious bias. It's producing a course for brokers on unconscious bias, and brokers can then teach that course to their agents. And you'll hear from Alexia about the new simulation or game called Fairhaven, which I put a lot of faith in as a useful way to learn the ins and outs of the choices you make and how they affect fair housing. NAR is also talking about making a film about, it's working on a film about good role models who follow the fair housing law. I think all this seems useful. From a layman's perspective, you know, we're journalists. We were sort of acting as air traffic controllers, sending these testers out, and we'd come back and we'd watch the videos, and we'd communicate with the agents. And we kept thinking, well, how hard would it be to stop steering if you were running a real estate brokerage? And we're laymen, but we could see a few areas for improvement. It seems clear that agents need a rigorous standard for what they do and don't do with every customer. If we give some customers this brochure on the school district, give it to everyone. Time and again, we saw customers come back from the same agent. One has a fat folder and one has a skinny folder. You can fix that. We also wondered if brokers were doing anything to monitor for steering, any kind of checking of which listings were being given to which customers, and how the map of that listing matched up with the criteria, the area, the other criteria that the customer was asking about. it didn't seem as though there was anybody looking over the shoulder. And I know that the MLS sort of encourages a lot of the screens you click on, they encourage your picking and choosing, this school district, that school district. Well, does the broker know if the agents are picking the same school districts for everyone? So the simple advice from NAR is pre-approve people the same way. React to their objective criteria, bedroom size, areas, and not stray into vague criteria like a better community or a good place or good schools or nice. It is clear also that some things might help but wouldn't be cure-alls. So for example, diversifying the workforce would probably help, but we saw steering by agents of all races and nationalities. It's not a fix, but it might help. Having offices in minority areas might help. Our 12 companies had more than 200 branch offices. Not a single one of them were in the areas where the racial minorities lived on Long Island. And you could argue that being more aware of minority communities, the beautiful homes on the water in some of the minority areas were being steered around, perhaps out of ignorance and unawareness. So those things might help, but wouldn't be cure-alls. Better training might help, but you were already requiring training in New York, and the training was sort of slipshod. So I guess part of the answer here is not to think of easy solutions as, oh, we passed this, or we did that training, or we had that one conversation, so it's fixed. As a layman, I have to ask about the advice of watch your biases, and when you're evaluating what a customer wants, ask yourself, why did you eliminate certain areas? I have to ask, why are agents eliminating areas at all? If a person wants to be within 20 minutes of downtown or the university, and this is their price range, why not give them all the listings that meet their criteria? In other words, the way to stop illegal steering might be to stop steering at all. Why do agents need to be picking and choosing neighborhoods and school districts? That's what I wonder as a layperson. I know that you all want to make sure that everyone who calls or emails or walks in someday is treated fairly. What I hope you'll take from this is let's all watch the 40-minute video called Testing the Divide, have a popcorn night when you can all get back together, and try to focus the conversation not on, well, who has a racial bias in our office. It's not very helpful. Focus the conversation on, how does it work? What can we do to standardize how it works so that everybody is treated the same? I'd like to hear more questions from you, and I really thank you for your attention.
All right, so I do have a couple questions from the chat. The first one, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but it says, my understanding is that no brokerages or agents featured in this report were charged by New York State or the local governing bodies. Is that correct?
It's true, not yet. It's funny because if our goal had been to get somebody's license pulled, we would have done multiple tests of the same agent. We only did one test of each agent, one pair. We did multiple tests of the brokerages, of the offices, and we're told the investigation continues. I think these substantive changes in laws and regulation are what's important. Whether or not some particular person who's already been embarrassed by being in our video and having to appear before a state hearing loses their license, I don't think that's especially important.
Perfect, thank you. The second question from the chat is, what did you mean by brokers, managers to supervise agents?
Yeah, it came up in the state Senate hearings that there was a lot of doubt expressed by state senators about how a broker who's responsible for the actions of dozens or hundreds of agents could possibly supervise that many and know whether they're obeying the fair housing laws or not. That was the underlying impression that the senators had. And so what they said was, if you're delegating from a broker to sort of an associate broker, and you may know more, you'll know a lot more than I do about this, but if you're delegating to an associate broker to run an office, that associate broker has liability and responsibility for monitoring the fair housing actions of all the agents in that. What they were saying was being unaware is not a defense. And you can look at that state law, and I'm sure your state people are looking at these state law proposals in detail, but that was the intent of it, is as far as I can go on that.
Perfect, thank you. The third question I have for you from the chat is, where do we see the interviews of the agents who were tested?
Yeah, so you go, there's all the stories and all the videos are at newsday.com/divided. And it's divided, there's a menu at the top, it's divided into like 13 chapters, and you dig around in there and you can see maps and you can see the videos.
Perfect. And the last question that we have from the chat right now is, are you presenting this in other real estate venues?
Yes, I've talked with, I was on with Washington State the other day, and the state association president was on, and he said, we're going to start testing our agents. That knocked me back. The California Association, I've talked to associations across the country, small ones in Florida and Houston and, all around. And it's been very surprising how this little project in New York has it started a conversation. Clearly, you're going to get more reaction from legislators in the state where the stories are published. But because of NAR's action on this, you may get more long-lasting change from NAR saying, let's talk about training. Let's talk about what bias we may be expressing unconsciously. Let's look at the state laws, state by state. These changes could be long-lasting. It's very encouraging.
Perfect. And that looks like it is all the questions that I have from the chat for now. So thank you so much for answering those for our members.
You're very kind. Thank you all so much.
Now I would like to introduce Alexia Smokler. Alexia Smokler is NAR's Senior Policy Representative for Fair Housing. She formally joined NAR in January of 2021 after working as a consultant for most of 2020 on the launch of NAR's Act, Fair Housing Plan. Alexia served as a project manager for the development of Fairhaven, a fair housing simulation. She contributes to the development of NAR's fair housing related legislative and regulatory policy priorities and develops fair housing resources and training for members, associations, and brokerages. Alexia previously worked in fair housing enforcement at HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. Before joining HUD, she served on the Washington, D.C., and Detroit staffs of Congressman John Connors Jr. Alexia has also worked with civil rights organizations on fair housing and voting rights. She is a licensed attorney.
Good morning. Thanks for that introduction, Andy. And great to hear from you, Bill. My name is Alexia. I'm the Senior Policy Representative for Fair Housing at NAR, and it's great to be with you this morning. My position at NAR is new. It's one of 3 new fair housing positions that NAR has created in the last 18 months. We are devoting substantial new resources to fair housing, and you're going to be hearing a lot more from us in the weeks and months ahead. So as Bill mentioned, a few weeks before the Newsday investigation was published, NAR had just filled the first of those new positions, and it hired Brian Green as its new director of fair housing policy. Brian used to lead fair housing enforcement at HUD. He is one of the most knowledgeable and dedicated people out there when it comes to fair housing. And it was my privilege to learn fair housing from him when I was on his team at HUD. 3 weeks after Brian started on the job at NAR, Newsday's Long Island Divided investigation was published, and it rocked the industry. After Bill's presentation, you can see why. Newsday kicked our efforts into high gear, and as Bill mentioned, we launched our ACT Fair Housing Initiative. A for accountability, C for culture change, and T for training. Today, I'm going to give you a little demo of one piece of that initiative, our new training simulation, Fairhaven. It was my privilege to be the project manager for NAR's development of this program. Fairhaven is a new approach to fair housing training. There isn't anything else like it. We decided to create it not long after Newsday was published. As you saw in those videos, agents referenced their fair housing training. They talked about steering, and they said they weren't supposed to do it, and then they did it. Something wasn't connecting. We could see that we needed a new kind of fair housing training, one that teaches not only the substance of fair housing law, but would also move more agents to embrace it. It's not your traditional lecture and quiz. Fairhaven is an immersive simulation experience that forces learners to confront discrimination in scenarios that feel real. And it uses storytelling to affect the learner's emotions. The scenarios in Fairhaven are inspired by real fair housing cases and by conversations we had with NAR members as we developed it. Learners in the fictional town of Fairhaven take on the role of an agent as they make their way through the simulation, working against the clock to sell homes. They make decisions as they interact with clients and colleagues. Those decisions affect the outcome. Sometimes in Fairhaven, we flip the script. The learner finds herself in the shoes of a client on the receiving end of discrimination. We pair those client point of view scenarios with video testimonials from real people who have experienced discrimination in a housing transaction. The idea here is to inspire empathy and a deep acceptance of fair housing principles. So let's take a look. Let me just figure out how to share my screen here. Are we seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so you can access Fairhaven at fairhaven.realtor. We also have Fairhaven available as a software package that can be loaded onto your brokerage or association learning management system. Oops, hang on, let's try this again. You log into Fairhaven using your NERDS ID, by the way. So when learners launch the course, they're going to see a 2-minute video setting up the stakes and introducing them to the town of Fairhaven and their role in the simulation. So let's just take 2 minutes to watch.
Welcome to Fairhaven. From our rapidly expanding downtown area to our thriving suburban neighborhoods, our magnetic metropolis attracts new businesses, tourists, and of course, new residents. As a potential home buyer, you'll get to explore our vibrant neighborhoods. No matter what you're looking for, there's a place and a price point that fits your wants and needs. As a real estate agent in Fairhaven, you get to help prospective buyers find their ideal house, townhome, or apartment. Your task in this simulation is to sell 4 homes within 6 months while adhering to fair housing principles. This is your opportunity to grow your reputation in the community and build a business that champions inclusiveness and diversity. Here in Fairhaven, we're committed fairly, but there's still a lot of work to do. Join our journey and help us make Fairhaven a thriving, inclusive community.
So as I mentioned, learners in the fictional town of Fairhaven take on the role of an agent. And the goal is to sell 4 homes in 6 months. I hope you've noticed the beautiful design. Fairhaven has a very modern look and feel. It's a very lovely place to be until you start running into all the discrimination that's going on. As learners make their way through the scenarios trying to sell homes, they will confront different kinds of discrimination. In most scenarios, learners will have the opportunity to make a sale if their choices align with fair housing principles. If the learner is not making the correct choices, she will get fed more scenarios and have more opportunities to make sales until the time runs out. This means that the simulation can take from 60 to 100 minutes to complete, depending upon the learner's performance. The learner receives feedback and resources along the way, and a report at the end, summarizing their performance. This is the user interface. Up here, it shows you how many transactions you've closed, how much time you have left. The menu where you can go check out the different neighborhoods of Fairhaven, control the volume, etc. Here's an email address where you can send me all your questions. This is our first scenario. I'm going to let this little video play and then I'll talk to you about it. So in Waterfront Mansion, our client is Carl Robinson. He is a qualified buyer who wants to buy a very large house. In this scenario, which is based on a real fair housing case, the seller backed out of the agreement after learning the buyer was Black. Turn down the volume now. As the learner makes her way through the simulation, she'll make decisions as she interacts with clients and colleagues. Here, the learner has to decide how to advise Mr. Robinson in the face of discrimination. In this scenario, I just made choices that did not get me the sale. I did not stand up for Mr. Robinson. He chooses to work with a competing brokerage, and they help him buy his waterfront mansion. We see a variety of fair housing issues in Fairhaven. In this scenario, I'm working with a client who uses a wheelchair. He needs a modification to access the condo building lobby. In this scenario, I've just made choices that help my client work with the condo board to get the ramp he needs to access the building. In the process, I've also educated the condo board on their fair housing responsibilities, and I get a sale. You can see here, as soon as I get to the next page, I can click out and get access to more resources. This is a very technical thing about reasonable accommodations for those who want to go deeper. But we also click out to more accessible, brief resources as well. So I'm going to show you just one more scenario. Here, we're switching perspectives. We're stepping into the role of the client. As I mentioned, we introduced this perspective shift to evoke an emotional reaction that encourages empathy in the learner. When you play the role of the client, you will be forced to make the kind of choices a client would have to make when being confronted with discrimination. In this scenario, you're a member of a gay couple who is not receiving equal professional service from a real estate agent. Throughout the simulation, we replicate receiving emails, texts, and phone calls from clients and colleagues to try to duplicate some of the elements of a real estate transaction. In this scenario, you were a client who could not buy the home you wanted and were qualified for because an agent failed to provide you with the same service she provides to other clients. Again, here we link out to more resources. In this case, it's NAR's resources on working with LGBTQ buyers and sellers. These client point of view scenarios end with video testimonials from real people who have experienced housing discrimination. In this case, it's a gay man talking about being harassed by his apartment building super because of his sexual orientation. We've had about 5,000 members complete Fairhaven so far. I'm going to close this now. And it's gotten consistently high marks from learners. We've had members tell us that it's opened their eyes to their own bias that they weren't aware of. We've had one learner tell us that he got mad when he felt like he was the client being discriminated against. And we've had other learners tell us that they have confronted some of these same situations in their daily work, and this training has given them the tools and a script, if you will, to know how to respond in particular situations. We think Fairhaven is a great tool, and we're really proud of it. I'll open it up to your questions now.
Danielle, did we have any questions in the chat?
Nope, we actually do. Oh, we do have one now. Sorry, it just came through. Can you take it again once you've taken it? And is there a cost? Those are two questions.
Yes, you can take it again. In fact, we encourage you to take it multiple times, and you might even try picking the wrong answers, because then you get fed more scenarios. If you breeze through and pick all the right answers, you actually won't see all the scenarios. So it's worth it to just kind of explore and see where different paths lead. In terms of cost, NAR is providing Fairhaven free to all members as a benefit of membership.
Perfect, thank you. And then I do have one more question. Can a staff member who is not an NAR member take the simulation?
A staff member of an association?
Not the association, but like a staff member in a, like in a real estate office. Mm-hmm. In a brokerage.
We are, we have, in the initial rollout, we were giving free access to everyone. We're now double checking on how we're going to handle non-member access, but we will find ways to make it available to everyone in your office who wants to access it. And I am going to put my email in the chat box so that anybody who has further questions can reach out to me.
We do have a couple more that keep coming in. Let me just scroll up because they're coming in faster than I can read. Let's see here. Do you get any CE credit for completing any of this?
No, Fairhaven unfortunately does not qualify for CE credit because it is too short and because the learning experience is variable. However, we are offering a new implicit bias classroom training that will qualify for CE credit, and we're piloting it in New York, actually. So that is something we'll have soon that you will be able to get credit for.
Next question is, how long does it take to complete, and do you have to do it all at one time?
It takes from 60 to 100 minutes, depending on your performance and how long you spend clicking out and looking at the different resources. And no, you do not have to complete it all in one sitting. Your progress will be saved and you can come back and complete it later.
Perfect. Will this be our new format for fair housing continuing education?
We are exploring building Fairhaven out, adding more scenarios, perhaps getting it into a format where it could qualify for CE credit. We're not there yet, but it's something we're entertaining.
Okay. And this isn't really a question, more of a comment, but it's a good one. It says, this seems like great training. It should be mandatory.
We've heard that a lot. We're exploring all options.
Perfect. And then let's see here. Perfect. I think I'm just going to scroll up because, like I said, they were coming faster than I can read them. One more is, who keeps track of the scores?
So Fairhaven is pass fail. You either sell the 4 houses in the 6 months or you don't. There is some scoring going on in the background, but that's not really the point. The point is to go through, have this experience, encounter these situations, feel these emotions, and most people do pass. That said, the scoring in the background is we have access to it at NAR. I can see it, but when we make this completion reports available to brokerages, the scores will probably be masked. So the only thing they'll see is whether it's been completed or not and whether you passed or failed.
Okay. All right, that one raised a little bit of a follow-up question. It said they did score us in 4 areas though.
Yes, we have, it has 5 learning objectives and there are percentage points allocated from each scenario to those 5 learning objectives. That's to see if you're catching on to the things that we're trying to teach you. But again, it's not the goal. It's not, I got an A. It's, I made it through and I passed them and I sold the 4 houses.
Perfect. All right, I think that is it for the chat questions. I don't see any more in here unless anybody asks. Oh, hold on. What about offering a reward to the brokerage with the highest percentage of successfully completed Fairhaven videos?
There are some associations that are doing challenge campaigns. I know in Virginia, they're doing a statewide challenge. And they will be recognizing the local association in their state with the most number of completions at their annual meeting. So we encourage associations and brokerages to get their members to take it in those competitive ways, if that helps.
Perfect. All right, and that was the last one. So I don't have anything else in the chat as far as questions go.
Thank you, Alexia, for all your good remarks, comments, and tutorial of the Fairhaven. To answer one of the questions that Danielle did ask, we are actually going to be running a contest in April during Fair Housing Month as well. So we're look out for details on that as well. So thank you for your time. We appreciate it and lots of good information.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.